The reek of metal and steam hung thick in the underground market of Veritha's Maw. Dr. Arlen Vine pulled his hood tighter, navigating the maze of stalls where smugglers and outcasts traded in whispers and shadows. His fingers traced the worn leather satchel at his side, containing fragments of ancient scripts that kept him fed in exile. He hadn't meant to look. Years of survival had taught him to keep his gaze low, to mind his own business in these lawless depths. But something made him turn toward the corner where even the desperate vendors wouldn't set up shop. She sat there on bare concrete, knees drawn to her chest, skin exposed to the damp chill of the underground. No clothes, no possessions, no identifying marks save for the faint scars that trace patterns across her shoulders. Around her, the market crowd flowed like water around stone, refusing to acknowledge what they couldn't sell or use. Arlen's breath caught, not at her nakedness or her alien features, the subtle ridge of bone along her jaw, the too many joints in her fingers. What stopped him was the rhythm of her breathing. In hold out, in hold out. The sacred cadence of the Ari, a language thought extinct for 3 generations. He should walk away. He'd done it before countless times. The weight of old guilt pressed against his ribs, memories of his sister Elare's face as the language weapons took hold, as her words became chains that bound her own mind. He'd sworn never again, but the girl breathed stories. Each exhale carried the ghost of meaning, and Arlen, despite everything, was still a linguist at heart. "You understand?" she whispered without looking up. Her voice carried harmonics human throats couldn't produce. "You hear the words." Arlen crouched beside her, careful to maintain distance. "Where did you learn this?" "Learn." Something like a smile touched her lips. "You don't learn breath. You inherit it. Mother to daughter, lung to lung." The market sounds faded as understanding dawned. She wasn't just someone who knew the Ari. She was a living repository, a breath keeper. The corporations had been hunting them for decades, trying to capture and commodify the last speakers of unwritten languages. "They sold the others," she continued. "But me?" A bitter laugh. "Damaged goods. The memory merchants did their tests, tried to extract what I carry. But breath can't be stolen, only given." Arlen's mind raced. The Living Culture Preservation Act, Article 17A. He'd helped draft it in another life, before everything fell apart. If he could prove she was a cultural bearer, not just a speaker. "What's your name?" "Mira." She finally looked at him, eyes the color of deep water. "And you're running from something too." He flinched. "How could you?" "Your breath stutters when you think of the past, like a story trying not to be told." The decision crystallized. Arlen stood, shrugging off his coat. "Put this on. We're leaving." "Why?" Suspicion sharpened her features. "What do you want?" "Nothing." The word tasted strange, true. "I'm invoking Article 17A. You're coming under cultural protection." Mira studied him for a long moment, then slowly reached for the coat. "The last person who tried to help me ended up in a memory wipe facility." "I'm already forgotten," Arlen said. "Can't erase what doesn't exist." The walk to his quarters took them through 3 levels of the city's decay. Mira moved like smoke, each step placed with careful deliberation. Under the coat, her breathing continued its ancient rhythm, and Arlen found himself matching it unconsciously. His room was small, cluttered with books and data crystals, the walls lined with handwritten notes in a dozen dead languages. Mira's eyes widened as she took it in. "You're a collector too," she breathed. "Was. Now I'm just a trader." He cleared a space on the narrow bed. "Sit. I'll find you proper clothes." As he rummaged through storage containers, Mira's fingers traced the air, following the shapes of words on his walls. "These are beautiful, but they're all silent. Silent. Written words are corpses. Pretty corpses, but still dead. Real language lives in the throat, dies in the air, lives again in memory." Arlen paused, holding a bundle of clothing. The corporations would disagree. They'd say preservation requires documentation. "The corporations killed my mother trying to extract her breath." Mira's voice carried no anger, only exhaustion. "They think memory is data. But you can't download a grandmother's lullaby. You can't digitize the way a father says goodbye." He handed her the clothes, then turned away while she dressed. How long were you in that market? Time doesn't mean much when you're inventory. They kept me sedated mostly. Woke me up for buyers, made me speak. But when they realized the breath wouldn't transfer, she trailed off. They dumped you, like spoiled meat. Arlen's hands clenched. He'd spent years running from his past, from a memory of designing weapons that turned words into cages. But here was someone who embodied everything he'd once claimed to protect. You need food, he said. Rest. Then we'll figure out how to keep you safe. Safe. Mira laughed again, that broken sound. There's no safe for people like us. Only breathing room between disasters. Over the following days, they fell into an unlikely rhythm. Arlen would leave to trade his linguistic fragments, returning with food and supplies. Mira would sit by the single window, breathing stories to the polluted sky. Sometimes he'd catch fragments, genealogies encoded in exhales, myths that lived in the pause between breaths. Teach me, he asked one evening, watching her work through a particularly complex sequence. Mira shook her head. You think with your pen, not your lungs. The breath would die in your mouth. Then help me understand. What are you preserving? She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, have you ever been in love? The question caught him off guard. Yes, once. Tell me about it. Not the facts, the feeling. Arlen fumbled for words. It was warm, safe, like finding home in another person. Now write that down. He grabbed a pen, scratched out sentences. When he finished, Mira took the paper, studied it. This is information about love. But is it love itself? No, that's the difference. I don't carry information about my people. I carry our actual breath. The way my grandmother sighed when she was content. The catch of my mother's voice when she spoke of freedom. The sound of my father's last words. Not descriptions. The actual moments living in my lungs. Understanding hit like cold water. You're not preserving language. You're preserving lives. Now you see why they want us. And why they can never have us. That night, Arlen dreamed of LRA. Not the broken thing she'd become after the language weapons rewired her mind, but his sister as she'd been, fierce, brilliant, unafraid. In the dream, she spoke in Mira's rhythm, and he woke with tears on his cheeks. Mira was sitting by his bed, concern creasing her features. You were calling a name? LRA. My sister. The words came hard. I couldn't save her. From what? From myself. For what I created. He sat up, rubbing his face. I designed weapons that turned language against the speaker. The corporations used them to break resistance movements. LRA was collateral damage. Mira's hand found his in the darkness. Is that why you helped me? Penance. Maybe. I don't know anymore. I do. Her grip tightened. You help because you hear the breath. Because you understand what dies when a language disappears. They sat in silence until dawn painted gray light through the grimy window. Then Mira stood, shedding the clothes he'd given her. What are you doing? Ending this hiding. She moved to the door. I'm going to the public square. I'm going to speak. Mira, no. They'll find you. They'll try to take what can't be taken. And fail again. Her eyes held a light he hadn't seen before. But maybe someone will hear. Maybe someone will remember. Arlen's mind raced. The square was monitored, full of corporate sensors. But if he could create enough official documentation, forge the right permits. Give me 3 hours, he said. Then we'll go together. She studied him. Why? Because you're right. Hiding preserves nothing. And because... He swallowed. Because I'm tired of running from what I owe the world. 3 hours later, they stood at the edge of the market square. Arlen had worked frantically, creating false documents, registering Mira as a living cultural asset, filing every form that might give her legal protection. It wouldn't stop the corporations, but it might slow them down. Mira stepped into the center of the square and began to breathe. At first, the crowd ignored her. Another street performer, another desperate soul seeking attention. Then the rhythm caught them. Ancient cadences that spoke to something deeper than conscious thought. People slowed, stopped, listened without understanding why. She breathed the story of the first words, when language was young and every sound carried magic. She breathed the genealogies of dead nations, the love songs of extinct peoples, the last words of languages killed by progress. Her body swayed with the effort, skin shining with sweat, but her breathing never faltered. The crowd grew. Market vendors abandoned their stalls. Children pressed forward, eyes wide. Even the security drones seemed to hover closer, as if drawn by something in the harmonics. Then Arlen spotted them, corporate agents, moving through the crowd with practiced efficiency. He stepped forward, documents in hand. Living Cultural Asset Registration 17A qualified, he announced, voice carrying over the square. Protected under interplanetary heritage laws. Interference constitutes a war crime against cultural preservation. The lead agent, a woman with chrome insignia, barely glanced at the papers. Step aside, citizen. This is corporate business. Article 17A supersedes corporate authority in matters of cultural preservation. I've filed the necessary. Your documents are fake. Her smile was predatory. Did you think we wouldn't run genetic markers? She's not registered in any cultural database. Arlen's heart sank, but Mira's breathing never paused. If anything, it grew stronger. The crowd pressed closer, forming an unconscious barrier between her and the agents. Move, the agent commanded. All of you. This is an unlawful assembly. Nobody moved. An old man in the front row was weeping silently. A child hummed along with Mira's rhythm. The air itself seemed to thicken with unspoken meaning. The agent raised her weapon. Last warning. Mira's eyes found Arlen's across the square. She smiled and breathed deeper. What happened next would be debated in 1,000 tongues. Some said the weapon misfired. Others claimed the agent simply couldn't pull the trigger. But Arlen saw the truth. The moment Mira's breath touched the agent's ears, the woman's hand began to shake. The corporate conditioning cracked, just for an instant, and in that instant she remembered being a child, listening to her grandmother sing. The weapon lowered. Mira breathed on, and the square filled with ghosts. Everyone heard something different. A mother's lullaby, a father's blessing, a lover's whisper, the voices of the dead, carried on the breath of the living. The agents retreated, outnumbered not by the crowd, but by the weight of memory itself. Mira swayed, exhausted, and Arlen caught her as she fell. Time to go, he whispered. They ran through the Undercity, following routes Arlen had mapped during his years in exile. Behind them, alarms wailed and search teams mobilized. But they had something the corporations didn't: the grateful silence of everyone who'd heard Mira speak. At the dock levels, Yelene waited with her battered freight hauler. Heard there was a disturbance, she said, eyeing their disheveled state. Cultural terrorism, they're calling it. Cultural preservation, Arlen corrected, helping Mira aboard. As the ship lifted off, Mira pressed something in his palm. A small crystal warm from her skin. The first breath, she whispered. The origin song of the Ari. My mother gave it to me, and her mother before that. I can't. You can. You will. She leaned against him, exhausted. Because I'm going to teach you to breathe properly. And because... She paused, vulnerability flickering across her features. Because I don't want to be the only keeper anymore. Arlen closed his fingers around the crystal. Where are we going? Halvar. Yelene called from the cockpit. Nice place. Quiet. Good for disappearing. As Verith's maw shrank behind them, Mira reached into her pocket and withdrew a strip of faded ribbon. She held it for a moment, then released it through the airlock. It tumbled away into space, a final goodbye to the past. My mother's, she explained. She wore it in her hair when she taught me the first sounds. Are you sure? The dead don't need ribbons. The living need hope. They sat in silence as stars wheeled past the viewports. Then, so quietly he almost missed it, Mira spoke in plain words. No breath rhythm, no ancient harmonics. I love you. Arlen turned, surprised. What? I love you. She said it like she was tasting the words for the first time. Not for saving me. Not for protecting me. For hearing me. For understanding that languages aren't just sounds, they're souls. He pulled her close, feeling the steady rhythm of her breathing against his chest. I love you too. Halvar was everything Veritha's Mall wasn't. Clean air, open skies, people who minded their own business. They found a small house on the outskirts of a farming community, where Mira's unusual breathing patterns drew curious looks, but no hostility. She began teaching him slowly, patiently, not just the sounds of the Ari, but the philosophy behind breath language. How to let meaning live in your lungs. How to speak without killing the words. "You're getting better," she said one evening, as they sat watching the sunset. "Your breath doesn't stutter anymore." "Good teacher," he replied, then attempted a simple phrase in the Ari. She laughed, the sound free and clear. "Your accent is terrible, but your intention is pure." They grew food in rocky soil, traded linguistics lessons for supplies, built a life measured in small moments rather than grand gestures. Sometimes, corporate ships passed overhead, scanning for fugitives. But the locals had developed a fondness for the strange couple who spoke in whispers and grew excellent tomatoes. One night, as autumn painted the sky in amber, Arland opened a fresh journal and wrote, "This is not the end of a culture. It's the beginning of a family." Mira read over his shoulder, then took the pen. Below his words, she drew a symbol he didn't recognize. "What's that?" "The Dari glyph for home. We had a written language once before we learned that writing kills breath. This is the only symbol we kept." "Why?" "Because home isn't information you store. It's a feeling you carry." She set down the pen and curled into his arms. "Like love, like breath, like us." Outside, the stars turned in their ancient patterns, and in the small house on Halvar, two people breathed in harmony, preserving not just language, but life itself. The next morning brought news from the core worlds. The corporations had officially abandoned their Breathkeeper program, declaring it economically non-viable. The public square incident had sparked something. Small groups gathering to share half-remembered languages, children learning to breathe stories from their elders, a quiet revolution of memory against forgetting. "You did that," Arlen said, showing Mira the news feed. She shook her head. "We did that. You gave my breath a chance to be heard." They stood in their garden, surrounded by growing things, and Arlen felt something he hadn't experienced since before LRA's death. Peace. "What happens now?" he asked. Mira smiled, her hand finding his. "Now we live. We breathe. We remember. And maybe, if we're lucky, we teach others to do the same." As days turned to months, their small house became a quiet pilgrimage site. People arrived with fragments of lost languages, seeking to understand what couldn't be written. Mira taught them all the same lesson. Language isn't possession, it's gift. You can't own breath. You can only share it. Arlen documented what he could, not in writing, but in his own developing breath speech. He learned to carry his sister's memory not as guilt, but as story, breathing LRA's laughter into the evening air where it could live again. One winter evening, as snow dusted their garden, Mira took his hand and placed it on her belly. "There's a new breath coming," she whispered. Arlen's eyes widened. "A child, a keeper, like me, like you're becoming." She smiled. "The corporations thought they could end us by isolating us. They never understood that breath finds a way." They held each other as the snow fell. Two people who had found in each other not just love, but purpose. In the distance, a neighbor's child practiced breathing exercises, stumbling over the rhythms, but persistent in the attempt. "Listen," Mira said softly. "The future, learning to speak." Arland listened, and heard in that young voice an echo of all the languages that had been lost and all that might yet be found. He thought of LRA, of forgiveness, of the long journey from weapon maker to breath keeper. "Thank you," he whispered. "For what?" "For teaching me that preservation isn't about documents or databases. It's about this." He gestured to the house, the garden, her belly, the distant sound of a child learning to breathe stories. "It's about choosing to live fully, to love deeply, to carry our dead gently, and our hopes fiercely." Mira turned in his arms, eyes bright with unshed tears. "You know what the most beautiful word in the Ari is?" "Tell me." She breathed it out, a complex pattern of inhales and exhales that seem to contain multitudes. It means the moment when strangers become family. There's no equivalent in any other language. What about love? Love is simple in the Ari. It's just this. She breathed in, held it, breathed out long and slow. The sharing of breath. The choice to live in rhythm with another. They stood together as night deepened, breathing in unison, two lives intertwined by choice and chance, and the strange magic of languages that refuse to die. Somewhere in the core worlds, corporations still try to commodify memory, to own meaning, to control the very words people use to dream. But here, in a small house on Halvar, the resistance lived on in the most human way possible. Two people choosing to make a future together, breathing stories to their unborn child, keeping alive what others would let die. I love you, Arlen said in the Ari, his accent still imperfect but his intention clear. Mira laughed, that free and healing sound, and answered in the same language. I love you too. Today, tomorrow, and in all the breaths between. The snow continued to fall, blanketing their small world in white silence. But inside the house, the air was warm with words, with memory, with the promise of all the stories yet to be told. This was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of everything. As spring returned to Halvar, bringing green shoots through thawing earth, their daughter was born. She entered the world breathing in perfect rhythm, as if she already knew the ancient patterns. Mira named her Eira, which meant first breath after silence in the Ari. She's perfect, Arland whispered, cradling the infant. She's hope, Mira corrected. Real, breathing hope. They raised her in both worlds. The careful precision of written language and the living flow of breath speech. Eira grew strong and quick, moving between tongues like a fish through water. By the time she could walk, she was teaching other children the simple rhythms, creating games where meanings danced in the air. The community grew around them. Not a formal school or institution. The corporations would have noticed that, but an organic gathering of those who understood that language was more than commodity. Former academics arrived, disillusioned by the memory wars. Refugees from linguistic purges found sanctuary. Children born into silence learned to speak with their whole bodies. Arlen built a workshop where he transcribed breath patterns into musical notation, not to capture them, but to help newcomers understand the rhythms. Mira tended the garden and the growing circle of breath keepers, her belly swelling again with her second child. One evening, as sunset painted the sky in familiar amber, a shuttle landed in the far field. Arlen tensed, hand moving instinctively to shield Eira, but Mira placed a calming touch on his arm. Look at the markings, she said. It's not corporate. The shuttle bore the faded insignia of the old Linguistic Heritage Foundation, thought disbanded decades ago. A single figure emerged, an elderly woman with silver hair and knowing eyes. Dr. Vine, she said, approaching slowly. I've been looking for you. Arlen stepped forward, keeping Eira behind him. That name belonged to someone else, someone who made weapons, and now makes gardens, the woman observed, surveying their flourishing plot. I'm Director Hannah Chun of what remains of the LHF. We've been working underground, protecting what we can of humanity's linguistic heritage. What do you want? Mira asked, joining them. To learn, Chun said simply. We've heard rumors. A new kind of preservation. Living archives. Children who speak in colors. And you, she looked directly at Mira, the last of the breath keepers. Not the last. Eira piped up, peeking around her father's legs. Mama's teaching lots of people, and there's another baby coming. Chen's eyes widened. You're teaching the breath language? But I thought it couldn't be learned, only inherited. Mira smiled. Inheritance isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about choice, about who you decide to breathe with. They talked through the night. Chen spoke of hidden archives, of resistance cells working to preserve endangered languages, of a growing movement against the commodification of memory. But she'd never encountered anything like what was happening on Halvar. We could help each other, she proposed as dawn approached. Your methods with our networks. Imagine breath keepers in every colony, teaching not just theory, but the philosophy of living language. Arland and Mira exchanged glances. They'd built something precious in their isolation, but could it survive exposure? The corporations, Arland began, are weaker than you think, Chen interrupted. The public square incident damaged them more than they admit. People are questioning the memory markets, demanding cultural autonomy. Your example could tip the balance. Mira stood and walked to the window, watching the sun rise over their carefully tended rows. When I was abandoned in that market, I thought I was the end of something, the last breath of a dying people. She turned back to them. But ends are just beginnings waiting to be recognized. They agreed to a careful collaboration. Chen would send small groups to learn, carriers who could take the breath philosophy to other worlds. In return, the foundation would provide protection, legal standing, and connections to other preservation efforts. As Chen's shuttle departed, Era tugged on her mother's dress. "Mama, will we have to leave here?" Mira knelt beside her daughter. "No, a little breath. This is our home, but home can grow. It can include more people, more stories, more songs." Like the garden? Exactly like the garden. That night, as they lay their daughter to sleep, Arland opened his journal to write the day's events. But instead of words, he found himself drawing. Circles connected by flowing lines, a map of breath and connection spreading across the page. Mira looked over his shoulder. "What's that?" "The future, I think. Or maybe the past. It's hard to tell with breath. It moves in all directions." She rested her head on his shoulder, one hand on her growing belly. "Do you ever regret it? Giving up your old life?" "Every day," he said honestly. "I regret what I was, what I did. But regret isn't the end of the story. It's compost, what you grow new life from." Spring deepened into summer. The first students arrived, a historian from Mars Colony who collected lullabies, twin brothers who spoke only in sign language, a former corporate linguist seeking redemption. Each brought their own wounded relationship with language, their own need to reconnect with something authentic. Mira taught them patiently, starting with the simplest lesson: forget everything you think you know about communication. Language isn't a tool. It's a relationship. "Breathe with me," she would say, sitting in a circle on the grass while Era played nearby. "Don't think about meaning. Just share air." Some left, frustrated by the lack of structure, the absence of textbooks or certification. But others stayed, found something they hadn't known they were missing. The garden grew. The circle widened. Their son was born as autumn arrived, entering the world with a laugh that sounded like music. They named him Drum, for the way his heartbeat felt against Mira's chest. He was different from his sister. Where she was precise, he was expressive, turning every breath into a song. "He'll be a storyteller," Mira predicted, watching him gurgle and coo. "Listen, he's already composing epics." The community had grown to nearly 30 people, living in scattered homes across the valley. They shared meals, traded skills, created a small economy based on gift rather than transaction. Corporate ships still passed overhead, but less frequently. The revolution Chun had spoken of was gaining momentum in the core worlds. One winter day, as snow began to fall, a familiar face appeared at their door. Arland froze, recognition hitting like a physical blow. LRA. His sister stood there, thin and travel-worn but undeniably alive. "Hello, brother." The reunion was tearful, complicated. LRA had survived the language weapon, though it had taken years to rebuild her sense of self. She'd heard rumors of his work, followed threads of story across the galaxy to find him. "I hated you," she admitted that night, sitting by their fire. "For what you created, for what it did to me." "I know," Arland said. "I hated myself, but then I heard about the public square, about a woman who breathed dead languages back to life, and a man who gave up everything to protect her." LRA smiled, the expression fragile but real. "I realized hate was just another kind of prison." Mira entered with tea, Drum sleeping against her chest. "You have your brother's breath," she observed, studying LRA, stuttering in the same places. LRA's eyes widened. "You can hear that. Family speaks in patterns, even when the words are different." She settled beside them. Would you like to learn to breathe without stuttering? That winter became a season of healing. LRA integrated into the community, her analytical mind proving invaluable in organizing their growing network. She and Mira developed a deep friendship, bonded by their shared experience of language as both weapon and gift. By spring, they had connections to 20 worlds, each with its own circle of breath keepers. The movement had grown beyond any single language or tradition. People were rediscovering the joy of speaking with their whole selves, of carrying their ancestors in their lungs rather than in databanks. On Era's 5th birthday, the community gathered for celebration. Children ran between the garden rows, their laughter mixing languages from a dozen worlds. The adults prepared food, shared stories, breathed together in easy harmony. As evening fell, Mira stood to address the group. She looked different now, stronger, more grounded, no longer the frightened girl Arland had found in that distant market. 5 years ago, I was nothing, she began. Garbage abandoned by those who couldn't extract value from my breath. Today, I stand here with family chosen and born, with friends who understand that language lives in connection, not isolation. She paused, looking at each face in the circle. The corporations want us to believe that preservation means control. That culture is property. But we know the truth. The only way to keep something alive is to give it away. Cheers rose, glasses clinked. But Mira held up a hand. There's something else. Something Arland and I have discussed with the council. She glanced at Chun, at LRA, at the other community leaders. We want to go public. Really public. Not just underground networks and whispered stories. We want to challenge the memory markets directly. Silence fell. Everyone understood the risks. Corporate retaliation, legal persecution, the destruction of what they'd built. But Era's voice cut through the hesitation. Mama's right. Hiding doesn't change anything. We have to breathe where everyone can hear. From the mouths of babes, Arland thought, pride swelling in his chest. The vote was unanimous. They spent months preparing. Legal documents were filed, invoking every cultural protection law still on the books. Allied journalists were briefed. Safe houses established on sympathetic worlds. And at the center of it all, Mira practiced breathing. The most complex pattern she knew, the origin song of the Ari, the first breath that contained all others. The day came in high summer. They chose the grand plaza of Nexus Station, the trading hub that connected all human worlds. Millions would pass through. Billions more would watch the feeds. Mira stood in the center, no longer naked and abandoned, but clothed in the woven gifts of their community. Around her, in concentric circles, stood the breath keepers. Arland beside her. LRA, their children, students and teachers, all breathing in unison. The cameras rolled. The crowds gathered. Corporate security forces massed at the edges, but held back. The legal protections were real this time. The public sentiment shifted. Mira began to breathe the origin song. It started softly like wind through grass, then built, harmonics adding layer upon layer. The other breath keepers joined, each contributing their own linguistic heritage. The air itself seemed to shimmer with meaning. Those who were there would later struggle to describe what they heard. Some said it was like remembering being born. Others spoke of hearing their grandmother's voice. Children understood it best. It was the sound of everything connecting to everything else. The performance, though that word felt inadequate, lasted 3 hours. By the end, even the security forces had lowered their weapons. Several were openly weeping. As the last breath faded, Mira spoke in standard tongue. This is our gift. Not for sale, not for keeping. Free as air to any who would learn to breathe. The aftermath was seismic. Within days, corporate stocks plummeted as investors questioned the ethics of commodified memory. Preservation laws were rewritten. Breathkeeper circles formed on every human world. But for Arland and Mira, the real victory was smaller, quieter. They returned to Halvar, to their garden, to the simple rhythm of daily life. They taught. They loved. They raised their children in a world slightly more open to the idea that language was relationship, not resource. Years later, when Aira was preparing to leave for university. Choosing to study xenolinguistics, to her parents' delight, she asked her father, "Do you think we really changed anything?" Arland considered, watching Miro work in the garden, Drum and his younger sister helping her tend the rows. "We changed ourselves. Sometimes that's enough. And sometimes it's everything," Mira added, joining them. She was graying now, laugh lines deep around her eyes. But her breath still carried the ancient rhythms, still held space for the dead and the living alike. That night, as they had every night for nearly 2 decades, Arland and Mira lay together, breathing in harmony. He opened his journal, now one of many volumes, and wrote, "Today our daughter asked if we changed the world. I told her we changed ourselves. But the truth is simpler and more complex. We learn to breathe. To really breathe. To carry our dead gently and our living fiercely. To understand that preservation isn't about keeping something unchanged, but about helping it grow." Mira read over his shoulder, then added in her own hand, "The breath continues. In our children, in our students, in strangers who learn that language is not cage, but wings. This is the only immortality worth having." They closed the journal and settled into sleep, still breathing in unison after all these years. Outside, the stars turned in their ancient patterns. In the garden, new growth pushed through dark soil. And somewhere in the galaxy, a child was learning to speak their first words, not from a databank or a program, but from the living breath of someone who loved them. This was not the end of their story. Stories like breath have no true end. They continue, carrying forward what matters, leaving behind what doesn't, always moving toward the next word, the next life, the next moment of connection. In the morning, there would be new students, new challenges, new languages to birth from the marriage of preservation and change. But for now, there was just this, 2 people who had found each other in the darkest market of the cruelest city, who had chosen to build something beautiful from abandonment and exile. 2 people breathing as one, keeping alive what others would let die, proving with every inhale and exhale that love, like language, cannot be commodified, only given, only shared, only lived. The breath continues.